met some new friends who came in from a town called Bear Canyon, which was even smaller than Fairview, which is hard to believe. We were way the hell out on the edge of the northern prairie. There was only one town north of us, and then it was like Siberia. It's like you could walk 3,000 miles north, and then you'd run into some Russian, on the steppe, and that was that. And these kids came from even farther north, and there wasn't northwest, and there wasn't even a high school there, so they moved in. They were kind of ambitious, and so as my friends disappeared, because they were pursuing their shorter term interests, let's say, I made these new friends, and they were better. They'd had good relationships with their fathers, so that was one thing. All three of them had good relationships with their fathers. They actually had some ambition, despite coming from this little town, and they were off to college, and they were willing to do well in school, well enough, anyways, to ensure that their futures weren't compromised, and they weren't, what would you call it, spinelessly obedient. They managed that nice balance between having a clue and doing something useful and also being cool. So that was good. That was really good. And we went on a trip with them, a long trip, 1,500 miles, something like that, and took along Rob and Chris. Jesus. And Chris just wasn't interested in anything on the trip. We drove through the Rocky Mountains, and we drove to lots of interesting places, and we had some good adventures on little beaches there, and we had a good time. He wasn't interested. He was mostly interested in smoking cigarettes and pot and buying soft drinks, and we were kind of laughing at him because he was so undermotivated, and bugging him about it. But he was unhappy and miserable, and it wasn't going anywhere, and so that sucked. And then we went off to college, and he came, but he dropped out after like 3 months, and then he did a bunch of desultory jobs that were really good for nothing, and then that wasn't good either. And then I went through college and got my bachelor's degree, and I moved to Montreal, and I went to graduate school, and one day Chris announced that he was coming to visit, and I hadn't seen him for a long time, and so he came to visit, and he still had his truck. So I guess it did actually survive the convenience store episode, and I was kind of happy to see him, but I would say he wasn't in good shape. I was about 27 or 28 at that point, and my life was going upward in a pretty decent direction, and his wasn't, and so he was more like 40-year-old, 27-year-old, and he'd been smoking too much. His fingers were yellow, and and he was too thin, and he was a lot more cynical than he used to be. Before that, I remember one episode with him. I was walking down the street with him in a town called Edmonton, which was where I had been going to college, and he had come out to visit, and we were walking down the street. It was winter, and he was snapping off the rear view mirrors of cars, the side view mirrors of cars, one after another. And this was irritating the hell out of me because it seemed pointless. And I said, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, all these people, they're just driving these cars. All their activity is just ruining the planet, and they deserve whatever punishment can be meted out to them. And this is the toxic masculinity thing. See, one of the things that had happened to him was that he had deeply incorporated this idea for one reason or another, and a reason I can't quite understand, that any ambitious activity on the part of someone, perhaps someone at all, but certainly on the part of someone who was male, was wrong. And the reason it was wrong was because, well, look at what we were doing to the planet. We were polluting the damn thing in 50 different ways, and there was the omnipresent threat of thermonuclear war, and we weren't concerned about global warming at that point. I think it was global cooling instead, because that was a big deal for a while in the 70s. But in any case, and we were overpopulating the damn planet to the point where by the year 2000 there was going to be mass starvation, and we were going to run out of fossil fuel, and there are more fossil fuel reserves now, by the way, than there has been ever, just so you know, which is quite curious. So we haven't run out yet, and we're not likely to, and we're not going to overpopulate the goddamn planet. We're going to hit 9 billion in about 20 years, and then the population is going to precipitously decline. And so all of that turned out to be utter utter anti-human nonsense, which he imbibed thoroughly and used, I think, in part to justify his unwillingness to participate in the world, but also because there was some genuine moral concern on his part that participating in the world, let's call it the oppressive patriarchy, was somehow negative in and of itself, and that people were a cancer on the face of the earth, which I think is how we were described by the Club of Rome, which is not exactly a description I'm particularly happy about, because you know what you do with cancer. You try to eradicate it. And so he had these very lofty ideas about why he wasn't participating. He was sort of an active Buddhist in some sense, or a passive pseudo-Buddhist in some sense, and could justify his lack of involvement in the world by making reference to the fact that any sort of masculine ambition was only contributing to the destruction of everything good. And so he never really got a girlfriend, and he never really got a job, and he never really had a life. And, that's not so good. That's not a real recipe for anything but bloody, profound misery and bitterness. And by the time he came to visit me in Montreal, that was there in spades, man. It was there in spades. And the darkness that was in him was a lot deeper and a lot more dangerous. And I would sit and analyze his dreams now and then. And he had dreams that were quite similar. One of them was he was in a spaceship way out in space alone. And he was the only person on it. So it was this dead mechanical entity floating out in the chaotic void. And he was the only person that inhabited it. And that's just not a good dream. It's not a good dream. And I was living with my wife at that point, and her and Rob used to get into entanglements quite a bit because he actually liked her quite a lot, so there was some rivalry between us in high school with regards to her. But more importantly, she really doesn't have any patience with useless men. And so when he was being useless, she would call him on it in a pretty straightforward way. And that just didn't make him happy. One time, this is exactly what he was like. He was sort of, we'd made arrangements, because he moved in with us. We made domestic arrangements about who was supposed to do what. And he would take care of our daughter a bit and do some work around the house. And he actually got a job, which was a good thing. But he was very resentful about what he had to do, generally speaking, especially domestic duties, even though hypothetically he was an egalitarian. And one day we came home and he was fixing the stove, which sounds like it was wobbly, and it sounds like a pretty good thing to fix the stove. That's a good thing, except that dinner was on the top of the stove and it was like burning, and not just a little bit, like it was burning like a statement, And so we walked in there and the bloody kitchen was full of smoke and Rob was down on the floor. Chris, Jesus. Definitely going to get in trouble for this. And he was shimming the stove. And it was so interesting to watch because on the one hand, what he wanted was a pat on the head for being mechanically apt enough to fix the stove. And on the other hand, he wanted to burn the hell out of dinner and fill the entire apartment with smoke to indicate that he was above that sort of domestic necessity. And so both of and then, of course, he also thought, because there was a deep arrogance that was associated with whatever was going on with him, that we would be too stupid to notice what was going on. And we actually weren't that stupid, particularly my wife, who wasn't very stupid about that sort of thing at all. And she just tore him a new skin. And it was brutal, man. And I was worried because, she really enraged him because he was very angry at women because, of course, women didn't want to have anything to do with him at that point because he was completely good for nothing. And so he was very mad about women, even though, he had decided a long time ago that, having a relationship and getting married and having children and all that was just contributing to the downfall of the planet. It's like, yeah, sure. you still want to mate, you still want companionship. That's all complete bloody ideological bullshit, and you know it, and it's just covering up your inadequacy, and it's making you vengeful, and it's filling you with hatred. And that really came out, and there was a vicious, vicious fight. And I was like making sure that it didn't get out of hand. And it sort of did, but not too bad. And then we had this weird experience. I don't know how to explain this, but it happened, so I'm going to tell you the story anyways. The next day, I think it was the day after that. I believe it was the day after that. My wife and I, she was pretty upset about this for a good reason. We lived in a poor part of Montreal, but you could go underneath the railway tracks, and then you could get into a rich part of Montreal where there was a nice park. And so we went for a walk in this park. And don't be thinking that it was fun, because it wasn't. It was like 28 below, and it was really windy, because Montreal has brutal wind along with its brutal winters. And it was like no one with any sense at all, except for people with homicidal roommates, were out in the park. And so we were out in the park, and she was thinking maybe she'd go to Ottawa, a city a ways away, to get away for a while. And we walked into the park. It was an uncanny day because it was so brutal at our house because of what was going on. And we knew what was happening with Chris and how dark it was and how unlikely it was to be fixed. And we went into the park, and God, it's the strangest thing. There were black squirrels in Montreal. And squirrels hibernate, basically. Not exactly, because they'll come out when it's warm in the winter, which isn't that often in Montreal. But basically, when it's cold, they go in their little squirrel burrows, which are all packed with nice warm material, and they stay the hell in there because it's 40 below, and you die if you go out, as I already mentioned. And we walked into the park, and we were the only people there, and it was foggy and windy, and there was all these bloody squirrels all over the place. And they had mange, and mangy squirrels lose a lot of their fur, so they were tailless squirrels and squirrels without hair on the back of their bodies. And they were all over the place. There must have been like 40 of them, like clinging to the trees, shivering away. And it was like a stage set, It's like, what the hell? What the hell are these squirrels? It was like the place was full of ravens or crows or vultures or something like that. We don't have vultures in Canada because it's too cold and they die. And it was perfect in this weird metaphorical way. It was like the stage was set for the conversation we had to have, and there was all these poor, furry, cute little animals that were out there in the cold, being insane for reasons we couldn't understand, like freezing to death. And so that added a real, I don't know what you'd call, real nice undertone of surrealism to the entire sequence of events. And so she went off to Ottawa for a few days. And then a little while later, my brother came with his wife, and Chris wasn't very happy about that either, because my brother had got married and was doing all right, not perfectly, but pretty all right. And then he had a girlfriend, which was all right. But he was also taking attention away from Chris. They were taking attention away from Chris, and that was making him angry. And, they decided they were going to go out for a walk. And Chris got dressed up in this like long black coat he had, and this like dark toque. And my brother got dressed up, and so did his wife. And we looked at Chris, and I think my brother laughed, said, "Chris, you look like a serial killer." And it's, ha, 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 it's a serial killer. You know how funny they are. And so they went for a walk, and then they came back. And Chris wasn't any happier when he came back. And he had his bedroom, and my brother and his wife were sleeping in their bed, and I was sleeping in my bed and with my wife. And it was like 2 a.m, and I wasn't sleeping at all. And then it was like 2:30 in the morning, and I wasn't sleeping. And it was like 3 a.m, and I wasn't sleeping. And I was thinking, man, there is something in this house going on that is like not good. And I knew what it was. And so I got up, and I walked over to Chris's door, and I knocked, and I came in, and then he was sitting up in bed, not looking happy at all. And I had a chat with him about how resentful he was feeling about everything, and just exactly what the hell he thought he was up to, and if he really thought that was a good idea, and talked him back down into something vaguely resembling sanity. And I don't know why I was awake. I think it was probably a smell, because you can smell things that you don't know you can smell. And that's part of what keeps you alive when you need to. But there was no doubt that some plot of bloody murder was being hatched in the imagination of my erstwhile friend. And I knew him well enough to know that he was capable of going extraordinarily dark places, and certainly had gone there that night. And anyways, we talked, and that was that. And it was settled, at least for that evening. And he went to bed, and I went to bed, and I went to sleep. But my brother woke up the next morning, and he said to me, he said, I don't know what the hell was going on here last night, but I really couldn't sleep. I don't know what was wrong. And I didn't really tell him what was going wrong, but that was what was going wrong. And, well, so we lived with Chris, for about another 6 months after that, and he actually made some progress. He got a job. It wasn't much of a job. He was working in a parts warehouse, which, by the way, is a fine job. I'm not complaining about that. And, I was trying to convince him that he could try to do a good job at his parts warehouse job. It was below his intelligence, because he was a very smart person, and he could have been anything, really, I think. And, I said, well, you can help. You can try to work hard there, and there are people running a business, and you can try to help them run the business better, and maybe you could get good at it and be helpful and find a bit of a community and straighten things out in the business to the degree that you can, and you'd have something, which would be a lot better than having nothing. And he did try that for a while, and we finally moved to Boston, and he didn't come along, and he visited us about a year later, and he wasn't doing too bad at that point. He'd moved back to Alberta, and he had a job there, and it was okay. It was okay. And he had started to write, and he wrote some nice stories, and he took some good photographs, too. He was quite talented, actually, at both of those things. But then, old habits reasserted themselves, or maybe his underlying illness reasserted itself, and he drifted back off into unemployment and moved back with his parents, and things just went from bad to worse. And he phoned me on his 40th birthday, and he was quite happy in a melancholy way. And he said that these short stories that he had been writing and he'd been sending to me, which he'd made into about 3/4 of a novel, and actually quite a good novel. He had a good eye for detail, and he could tell a story. And I'd liked his stories quite a bit. Anyways, they'd been compiled into a sequence of stories, and they'd been published by a small press in northern Alberta, which was quite an accomplishment, for him. And so he was very happy about that. And so we had that conversation and said goodbye. And then a week later, I heard from his father. He'd taken that goddamn truck out into the Rocky Mountains and hooked up a pipe from the exhaust to the cab and sat there smoking cigarettes until he died. And, they found him, I don't know, a couple of weeks later, which I don't imagine was particularly pleasant. And that was that. It was one less manifestation of toxic masculinity. We're playing a stupid game in our society, with young men, young women too, failing to encourage them properly and allowing them to believe that there's something intrinsically wrong with human beings and our activity. We cause trouble. We have a hard time regulating what we're doing. Life's tough, man, The world's out trying to kill us, and we're doing our best to survive, and we make a fair bit of mess while we're doing it. And we've done that forever. There's lots of blood and horror in history. There's no doubt about that, just like there is in the natural world. We've made our fair share of mistakes, that's for sure, men and women alike. Well, we've been building whatever we've been building. But, we had our reasons. It's not like it's a bloody cakewalk. We are trying to straighten things out. And it's good to separate the wheat from the chaff. I've seen this with lots of young men, lots of them, lots of the ones who come to see my talks. All they've heard their whole goddamn life is that there's something toxic and oppressive about our patriarchal society. And that's the fundamental way of looking at it. And that the right way of construing the relationship between men and women through history is one of unbridled oppression on the part of men in relationship to women. What the hell are they supposed to derive from that? What kind of message are they supposed to derive from that? Hey, that there's something good about ambition? There's something good about getting up in the morning and wanting to take your place in society? It's like, no, society, it's an oppressive patriarch. It's responsible for everything that's hell in the world. It's like, oh, so what are you supposed to do as a man, let's say? Withdraw? It's like, well, I'm not going to participate in that because it's all pathological. It's like, that's not helpful. I mean, then you don't have a life, right? You've got nothing to do, and it's not like there's no problems to solve. And you can rationalize it with this notion that, well, if I can't be good, and I can't because, toxic masculinity, then at least I can be harmless. It's like, well, harmless isn't good. Harmless is pathetic. You've got no respect for yourself if all you are is harmless. I mean, you're like, trust and put in a corner, you're harmless, and besides, you're not here to be harmless, you're here to be dangerous in a useful way. That would be good. So that was Chris. He couldn't figure out how to be dangerous in a useful way. So he became dangerous in a useless way. And that's another thing to think about, is that all these young men that we're teaching about toxic masculinity, well, we're trying to dampen down the oppressive patriarchy. We're going to teach them to be, let's say, harmless, or let's say useless, all of those things. And what's going to happen? You think that danger is going to go away? You're an absolute bloody fool if you think that you're going to reduce a human being, a man, to something harmless, and that's going to work. All you're going to do by failing to channel that unbelievable ambition and ability to move forward into the world into a self-restrained hopelessness is to produce someone bitter and resentful and then cruel and then dangerous. And I would recommend strongly against that.